There is a loneliness that comes before transformation. Not the loneliness of being rejected or abandoned, but the loneliness of outgrowing the world you've known. Of seeing truths others can't see. Of wanting things others don't understand. Of becoming someone that no longer fits into the spaces you used to occupy. This loneliness is crushing, disorienting, terrifying. It makes you question whether you're crazy, whether you've made a terrible mistake, whether you should just go back to fitting in even if it means betraying everything you've become. And most people do go back. They can't tolerate the isolation that comes with genuine transformation, so they shrink themselves back down to a size that others can accept. But Nietzsche understood something that makes this loneliness bearable, even necessary. The outsider isn't someone who failed to fit in. The outsider is someone in the process of becoming themselves. And that process requires a period of solitude so complete that it feels like exile. Not because you're being punished, but because genuine transformation can only happen when you step outside the herd, outside the comfort of collective thinking, outside the safety of living according to values that were never yours to begin with. You have to be alone to hear your own voice. You have to be separate to discover what you actually think, feel, want beneath all the conditioning. Look at the world we've built around avoiding this loneliness. We're more connected than ever, constant communication, endless social media, the ability to reach anyone instantly. Yet we're more anxious, more depressed, more lost than previous generations. Why? Because we've confused connection with belonging, community with conformity, fitting in with finding yourself. We've created a world where you're never alone long enough to actually know who you are beneath the performance, beneath the persona, beneath the desperate attempt to be understood and accepted by people who are themselves lost. Nietzsche saw this clearly over a century ago. He watched people trade their authenticity for acceptance, their genuine desires for social approval, their potential for greatness for the comfort of mediocrity. And he saw that the people who actually transform, who actually create something meaningful, who actually live rather than merely exist, they all go through a period of profound isolation. Not because they choose it initially, but because becoming yourself necessarily means leaving behind the world that knew you as someone else. This is where our exploration begins, in that terrible, necessary loneliness that precedes genuine transformation. In the space between who you were and who you're becoming, when you no longer fit with the old world but haven't yet found your new one. When your old friends don't understand you anymore and new ones haven't appeared. When the values you were raised with no longer resonate but you haven't fully formed your own. When you're suspended between two worlds, belonging to neither, questioning whether this loneliness will ever end or whether you've simply made yourself permanently alone. Most people can't tolerate this space. The moment they feel it, they panic. They reach out desperately to reconnect with people who no longer fit. They compromise their emerging values to fit back into the old world. They betray their own becoming to escape the loneliness. And in doing so, they abort their transformation. They stay stuck in a life that no longer fits, surrounded by people who will never truly see them, living according to values they don't actually believe in. All to avoid the loneliness that genuine growth requires. But what if that loneliness isn't the problem? What if it's the solution? What if the isolation you feel isn't evidence that something's wrong with you, but proof that something's finally right? What if the fact that you no longer fit means you've finally stopped forcing yourself into spaces too small for who you're becoming? Nietzsche would say that loneliness isn't the enemy of transformation, it's the prerequisite. You have to be alone to individuate. You have to be separate to discover your own values. You have to be outside the herd to see clearly what the herd can't see. This isn't the romantic notion of the lone genius working in isolation. It's the psychological reality that becoming yourself requires you to question everything you were taught, to examine every value you inherited, to test every belief you were given. And you can't do that while surrounded by people who are invested in you staying who you were. The moment you start questioning, the moment you start changing, the people around you will, consciously or unconsciously, try to pull you back. Not out of malice, but out of their own fear. Because your transformation threatens their worldview. Your questions make them question. Your growth requires them to examine their own stagnation. So they'll tell you you're changing, and they won't mean it as a compliment. They'll say you're not yourself anymore, and they'll be right. You're not the self they needed you to be. They'll accuse you of thinking you're better than them, when really you've just stopped thinking you're worse. They'll frame your boundaries as coldness, your growth as arrogance, your transformation as betrayal. And if you can't tolerate their judgment, if you need their approval to feel okay about yourself, you'll stop growing. You'll shrink back down. You'll apologize for becoming. This is what Nietzsche called the herd mentality. The way most people live according to values they've never questioned, beliefs they've never examined, in constant fear of standing out or standing alone. The herd offers comfort, belonging, the reassurance that you're normal. But it demands conformity in exchange. It requires you to think like everyone else, want what everyone else wants, measure yourself by standards you had no part in creating. And the moment you step outside that, the moment you question, the moment you diverge, the moment you become, the herd responds with judgment, with pressure to return, with the subtle and not so subtle message that who you're becoming is wrong. And that's when the loneliness hits hardest. Because you're not just alone, you're alone with the constant message that your aloneness is evidence of failure. You're isolated with the nagging fear that maybe they're right, maybe you should have just stayed comfortable, maybe transformation isn't worth this crushing solitude. You look around and see everyone else seemingly content, belonging, connected. And you wonder whether your dissatisfaction, your restlessness, your inability to fit back into the spaces you've outgrown, whether these are signs of growth or just proof that something's broken in you. Nietzsche's answer was uncompromising. The herd is comfortable because it's unconscious. People fit in because they've never questioned whether they should. They seem content because they've never imagined anything different. And you can't unsee what you've seen. You can't go back to unconsciousness once you've woken up. The loneliness you feel isn't evidence that transformation was a mistake. It's evidence that transformation is actually happening. You're in the space between. The chrysalis, the wilderness, the dark night of the soul that every genuine transformation requires. But here's what most people don't tell you. This loneliness doesn't last forever. It's a passage, not a destination. You're not becoming permanently alone, you're becoming yourself. And once you emerge from this period, once you've done the work of discovering your own values and living by them, once you've built a life that actually fits who you've become, you find your people. Not the people who knew you before, not the people who need you to stay small, but the people who recognize what you've become. The people who've made their own journey through the wilderness. The people who understand that real connection only happens between people who are fully themselves. So what actually happens during this period of isolation? What is the work that loneliness makes possible? Because if you're going through it right now, if you're in that crushing space between worlds, you need to understand that this isn't wasted time. This isn't punishment. This is the necessary condition for genuine psychological transformation. And understanding what's happening can make the loneliness bearable, even productive, in ways that simply enduring it cannot. The first thing that happens in solitude is that all the noise drops away. The constant input, the endless opinions, the pressure to perform, the need to explain yourself, all of it fades. And in that silence, you can finally hear yourself think. You can feel what you actually feel without immediately needing to process it with someone else or perform it for an audience. You can discover what you actually want beneath all the wants that were conditioned into you. You can start to differentiate between your authentic voice and the internalized voices of parents, teachers, culture, the herd. This differentiation is brutal work, because most of what you think is you isn't actually you at all. It's programming, it's conditioning, it's values you absorbed before you were old enough to question them. It's beliefs that were installed in you by people who themselves never questioned where those beliefs came from. And entangling what's authentically yours from what was given to you requires solitude. Because when you're surrounded by others, you're constantly reinforcing the collective worldview. You're constantly being reminded of what you're supposed to think, feel, want, be. Jung would call this the process of individuating, separating from the collective unconscious to discover your individual consciousness. And it's terrifying because the collective unconscious gives you identity, meaning, a sense of place. When you step outside it, when you start questioning the values everyone around you takes for granted, you lose those moorings. You're adrift. You don't know anymore who you are, what you believe, what matters. Everything that was certain becomes questionable. Everything that was solid becomes fluid. Most people can't tolerate this uncertainty. They need answers, need certainty, need to know where they stand. So they never actually individuate. They go from one collective identity to another, from the values of their family to the values of their peer group to the values of their political tribe to the values of their spiritual community. They're always belonging to something, being defined by something outside themselves. And they never experience the loneliness of standing alone because they never actually stand alone. But you can't become yourself while borrowing identity from the collective. You can't discover your own values while living according to someone else's. You can't find your authentic voice while constantly speaking in the language of the herd. So the loneliness, the isolation, the period of not belonging, this isn't the problem. This is where the real work happens. This is where you finally have space to discover who you are when no one's watching, what you think when no one's listening, what you want when no one's judging. Nietzsche called this self-overcoming, the process of becoming who you are by overcoming who you were taught to be. And he understood that it requires you to destroy before you can create. You have to tear down the values you inherited before you can build your own. You have to let the old self die before the new self can be born. And that dying process is lonely beyond measure because you're grieving who you were, the world you knew, the easy comfort of fitting in, all while not yet knowing who you'll become or whether you'll find your place again. This is the descent that precedes every ascent, the death that precedes every rebirth, the loneliness that precedes every genuine transformation. And you can't skip it. You can't bypass it with positive thinking or spiritual practices or throwing yourself into work or finding a new relationship. You have to go through it. You have to sit in the not knowing, in the between worlds, in the crushing solitude of being separate from everything familiar while not yet arrived at anything new. And in that sitting, in that enduring, something happens. You start to solidify, not around external validation or collective values, but around your own center. You start to know what you actually think, not what you're supposed to think. You start to feel what you actually feel, not what you should feel. You start to want what you actually want, not what everyone else wants for you. And that knowing, that clarity, that solidity, it only comes through solitude. It only emerges when you've been alone long enough that all the borrowed ideas fall away and what remains is genuinely yours. But this process isn't just internal. The loneliness also forces you to confront how much of your life was built on seeking approval, on fitting in, on being understood and accepted. When those things are suddenly unavailable, when you no longer fit, when people no longer understand you, when your old world no longer wants you, you have to find a different ground to stand on. You have to learn to approve of yourself even when others don't. To understand yourself even when you can't make others understand. To accept yourself even when acceptance isn't coming from outside. This is what Nietzsche meant by creating your own values. Not arbitrarily deciding what's right and wrong, but doing the deep work of examining every value you hold and asking, is this actually mine? Do I actually believe this? Or am I just carrying it because it was given to me? And when you discover a value that isn't yours, you have to let it go. Even if letting it go means disappointing people. Even if it means being judged. Even if it means more loneliness as you diverge further from the collective. The people who can't make this journey, who can't tolerate the loneliness of discovering their own values, end up living lives that never quite fit. They're always slightly uncomfortable in their own skin because they're living according to values that aren't authentically theirs. They're always seeking external validation because they never developed internal authority. They're always changing themselves to fit different groups because they never stood alone long enough to discover who they are when they're not adapting to someone else's expectations. And then there's resentment. Deep, corrosive resentment toward everyone who seems comfortable, everyone who fits in easily, everyone who never had to go through this lonely transformation. Nietzsche warned about this resentment, how it poisons the person who holds it, how it keeps you stuck in victimhood rather than moving through to the other side. Because yes, the loneliness is crushing. Yes, it's unfair that transformation requires this isolation. Yes, it's painful to watch others living comfortably while you're struggling through the wilderness. But the resentment doesn't serve you. It doesn't make the loneliness more bearable. It doesn't speed the process. It just adds bitterness to isolation, making you not just alone, but alone and angry about it. The alternative is acceptance, not of the situation as permanent, but of the loneliness as necessary. Accepting that this is what transformation costs. That becoming yourself requires being alone with yourself. That you're not being punished, you're being forged. Nietzsche's actual teaching can be understood through his concept of the Übermensch. Not the Superman in the sense of superiority, but the person who has overcome themselves, who has created their own values, who has become fully themselves. And every story of genuine transformation, every example of someone who actually became themselves rather than just becoming a better version of what others expected, includes a period of profound isolation. This isn't coincidence, it's necessity. Consider the examples throughout history. The spiritual teachers who went into the desert, the wilderness, the mountain caves for years before they emerged with their teachings. The artists who isolated themselves during their most productive periods. The philosophers who were outcasts, misunderstood, alone with their thoughts. The revolutionaries who saw what others couldn't see and were initially condemned for it. The pattern is consistent. Genuine transformation requires separation from the collective, a period of being outside, of being alone. But this isn't about physically isolating yourself in a cabin in the woods, though some do that. It's about psychological separation. It's about being willing to stand outside the herd mentally, emotionally, spiritually. It's about being able to think thoughts that others would judge, to feel feelings that others would condemn, to want things that others don't understand. It's about developing such a strong internal center that you can tolerate disapproval, misunderstanding, judgment, isolation without immediately rushing back to conformity. The practical application of Nietzsche's wisdom, then, is understanding that the loneliness you feel during transformation isn't something to fix or medicate or distract yourself from. It's something to move through consciously, extracting from it what it has to teach you. Every moment you spend alone with yourself, not reaching out desperately for connection or validation, is a moment you're building internal authority. Every time you sit with uncertainty rather than immediately seeking answers from others, you're strengthening your capacity for independent thought. This requires differentiating between healthy solitude and unhealthy isolation. Healthy solitude is chosen, at least in the sense that you're choosing transformation even though it comes with loneliness. You're actively using the alone time to know yourself better, to clarify your values, to build internal structure. Unhealthy isolation is when you're cut off and passive, when loneliness becomes depression, when aloneness becomes stagnation. The difference isn't always clear, and sometimes healthy solitude slides into unhealthy isolation if you're not careful. The key is whether you're using the aloneness productively. Are you doing the work of questioning your inherited values? Are you examining your patterns, your projections, your shadow material? Are you creating, writing, making art, building something that expresses what's emerging in you? Or are you just numbing out, scrolling endlessly, distracting yourself from the discomfort while still being alone? The loneliness of transformation is productive. The loneliness of avoidance is just suffering without purpose. Jung's concept of individuation maps onto Nietzsche's self-overcoming here. Both understood that you can't become whole while remaining in the collective. Both saw that genuine psychological development requires you to separate, to question, to stand alone. And both acknowledge that this is terrifying and lonely and that most people will never do it. They'll stay comfortable in the herd, living lives that were designed by others, dying without ever knowing who they might have become if they'd been willing to endure the loneliness of finding out. The ethical dimension here is important. Some people use Nietzsche to justify being cruel, dismissive of others, contemptuous of the herd. But that's a misreading. Nietzsche's point wasn't that you should look down on others, but that you shouldn't let their limitations limit you. He wasn't advocating cruelty toward those who choose conformity. He was advocating courage for those who choose transformation. The loneliness isn't something you inflict on others or lord over them. It's something you endure as the price of becoming. And there's compassion in understanding that most people can't pay that price. Not because they're weak or bad, but because the loneliness is genuinely crushing and they haven't developed the internal resources to survive it. You don't judge them for choosing comfort over transformation. You just recognize that you can't join them without betraying your own becoming. You can have compassion for their choice while still making yours. You can understand their need for belonging while accepting that you no longer fit into the spaces they occupy. The historical examples of this are both inspiring and cautionary. Inspiring because they show that the loneliness does end, that transformation does complete, that you do find your people eventually. Nietzsche himself was isolated, misunderstood, often alone, but his ideas found their audience eventually, long after his death. Van Gogh painted in obscurity, alone with his vision that others couldn't see. Countless thinkers, artists, revolutionaries endured periods of profound isolation before their work found recognition. But cautionary because some never found their audience. Some died alone, their work unrecognized, their transformation complete but never witnessed. And you have to be willing to accept that possibility. You have to be willing to become yourself even if no one ever understands, even if you never find your people, even if the loneliness never fully lifts. Because the alternative, staying small to avoid isolation, conforming to stay comfortable, betraying your own becoming to maintain connection, that's a death of a different kind. A death that happens while you're still alive, while you're still surrounded by people, while you're still belonging to something that was never meant for you. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes genuinely demanding. He's not offering you a path to popularity or comfort or easy connection. He's offering you a path to yourself, and that path runs through the wilderness. It requires you to be willing to be misunderstood, to be judged, to be alone. Not forever, but for as long as it takes. And no one can tell you how long that will be. No one can promise you that the loneliness will end by a certain date or that your people are definitely waiting on the other side. All you can know is that staying in the herd, living according to borrowed values, never discovering who you actually are, that's guaranteed loneliness too. It's just a loneliness that happens while surrounded by people. It's being alone with yourself while never actually meeting yourself. It's living a whole life without ever knowing who you might have been if you'd been brave enough to find out. And between those two lonelinesses, the loneliness of transformation or the loneliness of conformity, Nietzsche would say the choice is clear. At least in the loneliness of transformation, you're becoming someone. In the loneliness of conformity, you're just becoming more thoroughly lost. So where does this leave you now, in the middle of your own lonely transformation? You're between worlds, belonging nowhere, understanding that you can't go back but not yet knowing what's ahead. The old friends don't fit anymore but new ones haven't appeared. The old values don't work but your own aren't fully formed. You're suspended, isolated, questioning whether this loneliness is transformation or just proof that you've made yourself permanently alone. And I can't tell you that it gets easier, but I can tell you that it gets clearer. And I can tell you that the loneliness transforms from suffering into something else. Into solitude that's productive, into aloneness that's generative, into separation that's necessary rather than punishing. The practical work during this period is to use the loneliness rather than just endure it. When you feel isolated, instead of immediately reaching out to reconnect with people who no longer fit, sit with the isolation. Ask it what it's teaching you. Use it as information about what you've outgrown, where you're going, who you're becoming. The loneliness is showing you that you've changed. That's not a problem to fix, it's a truth to integrate. Start building the life that will fit who you're becoming rather than mourning the life that fit who you were. This doesn't mean you have to know exactly who you're becoming. You probably don't. But you can start making choices that honor your emerging values even when those choices increase your isolation in the short term. You can start saying no to invitations that don't resonate, even if saying no means more time alone. You can start pursuing interests that matter to you even if no one in your current circle shares them. You can start expressing thoughts that are genuinely yours even if they make others uncomfortable. Each of these choices will likely increase your loneliness temporarily. The people who knew you before won't understand. They'll judge, they'll pull away, they'll make you feel wrong for changing. But each choice also brings you closer to the life that will actually fit. Each time you honor your emerging truth rather than compromising to maintain connection, you're building integrity, the state of being integrated, whole, not fragmented between who you are and who you perform. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, you'll notice shifts. You'll meet someone who gets it, who's made their own journey through the wilderness, who recognizes what you're doing even if they don't know your whole story. You'll find a book or a teaching or an idea that speaks directly to where you are, that makes you feel less alone in your aloneness. You'll have a moment of clarity where you realize you're not actually lost. You're exactly where you need to be, doing exactly what you need to do, even though it's hard and lonely and uncertain. These moments don't erase the loneliness, but they contextualize it. They help you understand that you're not alone in being alone, that the path you're on is one that others have walked, that the isolation is part of the process rather than evidence that something's wrong. And gradually, the loneliness becomes less crushing. Not because you've found your people yet, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but because you've found yourself. And once you're solid in yourself, once you know who you are and what you stand for, the loneliness of being misunderstood becomes bearable because you understand yourself. This is what Nietzsche meant by self-overcoming. Not that you overcome external obstacles, but that you overcome the parts of yourself that need external validation to feel okay. You overcome the part that would rather fit in than be authentic. You overcome the part that measures your worth by how many people understand you. You overcome the part that would betray your own becoming to escape loneliness. And in that overcoming, you become powerful in a way that people who've never been truly alone can never understand. Because there's a strength that only comes through isolation, a clarity that only emerges in solitude, a self-possession that only develops when you've been alone with yourself long enough to know yourself completely. The person who's been through the lonely transformation and emerged on the other side doesn't need approval the way they used to. They don't need to be understood to know they're right. They don't need to fit in to know they belong to themselves. And that makes them dangerous to the herd but invaluable to anyone who's seeking genuine transformation. Your people will find you. Not the people who knew you before, not the people who need you to stay who you were, but the people who recognize who you've become. The people who've made their own journey through the wilderness and can see in your eyes that you've made yours. The people who don't need you to explain or justify or prove yourself because they know what it costs to become yourself. These connections, when they come, are different from what you knew before. They're not based on proximity or convenience or shared history. They're based on recognition, soul recognizing soul across the distance that transformation creates. But even if those connections never come, even if you spend the rest of your life more alone than you'd prefer, the transformation will still have been worth it. Because the alternative is spending your life surrounded by people who don't actually know you, living in spaces that don't actually fit, performing a version of yourself that gets more exhausting with each passing year. That's loneliness too. It's just loneliness with company, which is somehow worse because you can't even acknowledge it. At least in the loneliness of transformation, you know what you're doing and why. You know you're becoming rather than just enduring. Nietzsche's final gift in all this is permission. Permission to let the loneliness be what it is without immediately trying to fix it. Permission to outgrow people without guilt. Permission to change in ways that others don't understand. Permission to prioritize becoming yourself over being understood. Permission to walk the lonely path because it's your path, because it's leading somewhere that matters, because the alternative is staying lost in a crowd that will never see you anyway. The loneliness before you rise isn't punishment. It's preparation. It's the space where transformation happens. It's the fire that burns away everything that isn't actually you so that what remains is solid, clear, undeniable. And when you rise, not if, but when, you rise as yourself. Not as what others wanted you to be. Not as a compromise between your truth and their comfort, but as yourself, fully formed, wholly integrated, no longer needing permission from anyone to exist as you are. That rising might not look how you imagined. It might not come with recognition or applause or even understanding from those around you. It might be quiet, private, witnessed only by you and the few who've earned access to seeing you clearly. But it's real. It's yours. It's the life you built by being willing to be alone long enough to discover who you actually are beneath all the conditioning, all the performance, all the desperate attempts to belong. And once you've risen, once you've completed this particular transformation, though transformation never truly ends, you look back at the loneliness differently. Not as something that happened to you, but as something that happened for you. As the necessary condition for becoming, as the space that allowed you to individuate, to discover your own values, to build a life that actually fits. The loneliness was the price, but what you gained was yourself. And that trade, painful as it was, impossible as it felt at the time, that trade was worth it. If you're in the wilderness right now, if you're in that crushing space between worlds, if you're alone in ways that feel unbearable, know this: you're not doing it wrong. You're not broken. You're not being punished. You're being transformed, and the loneliness you feel is evidence that you're actually doing the work that most people refuse to do. You're becoming yourself. And that becoming, that process, that transformation, it's the most important work you'll ever do. Subscribe to this channel if these ideas resonate with you. If you're tired of surface-level positivity and ready for the real philosophical work of transformation. If you're willing to be alone to become yourself. If you understand that the path to genuine power, to real authenticity, to full aliveness runs through the wilderness and you're willing to walk it anyway. Because the work of becoming yourself, of enduring the loneliness of transformation, of rising from the isolation as someone finally, fully real, this work changes everything. And those of us who've walked this path, we recognize each other. We find each other eventually. And when we do, the connection is real because we each showed up as real. The loneliness made that possible. And for that, we wouldn't change a thing.